So I'm very pleased to introduce Alessandra Tanesini, and she's going to be speaking to us about whether or not we should be, whether we must be either ignorant or biased, a solution to Gendler's dilemma.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And please be patient with me because this is the first pass for this stuff, so it's very much work in progress. What I'm going to try, well, I might as well put the plan on. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to introduce what I call Gendler's dilemma. Comes from a paper by Gendler called On the Epistemic Costs of Implicit Bias, where she argues that in a racist, sexist society, even if you are not racist or sexist yourself, you are caught in a dilemma. Either you will be biased yourself, or you will consciously or unconsciously opt to be ignorant. Either way, you are condemned to epistemic suboptimality, right? So either way, you're either epistemically suboptimal because you're ignorant, or you're epistemically suboptimal because you're biased. So I will present the dilemma. I will introduce the notion of an attitude as that notion is understood in social psychology, because I think it will help us understand what's going on in the cases that Gendler discusses, and I think it also gives us a way out of the dilemma, so that I don't think we are condemned to either ignorance. Well, we might be condemned to either ignorance or bias, but not for the reasons that Gendler puts forward. And that's really most of the talk. And then I'll just very quickly say something about part 2 and part 3. Well, part 2, I want to say briefly that I think implicit biases are attitudes of the sort that we'll have discussed in the first part of the talk. And now, in part, their implicit biases are responsible for underrepresentation, but they're of women, and other groups, and ethnic minority groups, for instance. But there, to be honest, I don't really have much that is new to say, apart from the claim that implicit biases are implicit attitudes, and understanding them that way is of help. And it's especially of help because it gives us new strategies on how to address this bias, and hopefully I'll be able to say something brief about that. And the third, which is just one slide, but is my next research project, is that I believe that both intellectual virtues and intellectual vices can be understood as clusters of attitudes, and I'm hoping to then link that to the Gendler dilemma. So that's what I'm planning to do, and I made a big error from the start because I have no idea how long I'm meant to talk for.
About 45 minutes, if that's okay.
Fine. Okay. So let me say a few things about the dilemma according to Gendler. So basically she says, in a society that is as racist and as sexist as our own, if you use categories like race or gender or sex, depending on what your inclination is or what the subject matter is, you will find yourself, if you just use these categories, you'll find yourself as being biased as a result. And as a result of being biased, you will suffer certain specific epistemic costs, and she talks about cognitive depletion due to the effort of self-regulation. So the thought here, and I'll give you the examples, but the general thought here is that if you live in a sexist society, just because you live in a sexist society, if you use these categories, you will basically, implicitly in some way, adopt these sexist attitudes. As a result, you will find yourself in a situation of cognitive dissonance between your implicit biases and your explicitly held beliefs. This situation of cognitive dissonance brings some sort of discomfort, And the discomfort it brings means that you will try to resolve the discomfort. To do so, you will try to resolve the dissonance, and that requires intellectual work. So you will find yourself in a situation of cognitive load. Does that terminology make sense? Do you know what I'm trying to say? So you will spend cognitive energies in self-regulation, in trying to stop the biases. That means that you will not have intellectual energy, so to speak, to do other tasks, right? And so you will perform worse at certain cognitive tasks because your cognitive effort is directed elsewhere at self-regulation. And so this is a way in which, even if you're not sexist or racist yourself, in a racist or sexist society, you end up being suboptimal. You will work under conditional cognitive load when that is unnecessary, and that will deplete your ability to deal with other cognitive tasks. Right? And there will be all sorts of other cognitive tasks where your performance will be impaired. So in all of these ways, beside the fact that you use these morally dubious categories and you find yourself having these implicit biases, you have all of these epistemic costs. The other alternative, the only alternative for Gendler, is you try to ignore the implicit biases. You try to pretend that, you know, that these categories are useless. You try to not use the categories at all. I think it's doubtful, given her system, whether this is possible. But if it is possible, she thinks the result is you will not use the term race or gender at all, and as a result, you will be ignorant. Because in a society that is structured like ours, there are social facts that are best captured in terms of those categories, right? So if you want to know certain things about the discrimination that both women and black people suffer, if you're not allowed to use either the gender or woman as a category or race as a category, it's going to be very hard for you to express the social facts, knowledge of which is required if you want to understand discrimination. So either way, you're either suboptimal because you're biased and suffer from cognitive deficit. We don't have a little red dot, I always use that. Or you're ignorant. And that, of course, carries also epistemic costs. So that's the bind. And I have in your handout, you have a quote from Gendler that sort of tells you a formulation of the bind. Right, Gendler makes the point using 3 examples. And her case is very empirically based, and the 3 examples are very empirically based. And they are very interesting phenomena. Right. The first phenomenon is cross-racial face identification. I don't know whether you are aware of this, but at least I think it's about 78% of Caucasian people. Most of these experiments have been done in the US, but there is no reason to believe that it doesn't apply to European Caucasians. Find it much harder to recognize the face of people from other races than white faces. So the experiment would go like this. You are shown a bunch of faces of people, and then you're asked to sort of say, some time elapses, then you're shown some faces, which are the faces you had seen before, some new faces, and you have to say, yeah, this was in the first sample, no, it wasn't. White people are much more reliable at doing so for white people. There is some evidence that in part this is modulated by expertise. So if you grow up in an environment where you are more exposed to faces to people from other races, you're less bad at it. But the expertise and experience phenomenon does not, according to most studies, does not explain the whole phenomenon. something that I think is very interesting is that this phenomenon is apparent in children as young as 1. The second example that Gendler gives is poor performance under conditions of stereotype threat. You might all know what stereotype threat is, but a whistle to stop of the idea is that if you are yourself a member of a group that stereotypically is thought to be bad at certain tasks, and especially if the stereotype is that this is something as a matter of biology or a matter of, the way you were born is something that there is nothing you can do about. And if you are, especially if you are highly motivated to do well, then the moment your membership to that group is made salient before performing a task at which you are meant to be stereotypically bad, then your performance of that task clearly deteriorates. So women who are required to write down that they're women before they do a math test tend to perform worse than they do when they are not asked to write down their name or their gender. There is an exception, Asian women, which is if they're asked to both write down their race and their gender, they tend to perform better because they identify with the stereotypical good performance of Asian people. So the idea here is again that there is a kind of epistemic cost due to stereotype threat. You are cognitively depleted and you perform worse. And the third example is cognitive depletion in interracial encounters. So there is evidence that, this is really tragic I think, that if you are made to interact with somebody of a different race, especially if you tend to be high in implicit bias but low in explicit bias, the very fact that you are interacting with them will then make you perform worse on various cognitive tasks. And the idea here is that you spend so much cognitive energy in dealing with the discomfort of having to be in the proximity of somebody of another race, that will make you perform worse. Okay? So those are the 3 examples that Gendler gives of people who are on explicit measures, non-racist and non-sexist, but nevertheless find themselves being affected in these ways. Okay? And so it's a kind of epistemic cost. You yourself are explicitly not a racist, not a sexist person, but you find yourself being poor at recognizing the faces of people of other races. If you yourself are a member of a stereotype group, perform poorly certain tasks, and perform poorly at any cognitive task if after an interaction with a person of another race. Gendler's examples tend to be all race-based. The epistemic cost of not using these racial categories for Gendler is ignorance of fact about base rate frequencies. I will not talk much about this, but her example basically goes, and there is good evidence for this, but I think it can be read in a completely different way. So if you ask people how to judge, again it's been done in the States, if you ask people, what should the insurance premium be on a property in a certain area, and people tend to think of it in actuarial terms, i.e. in risk terms, because sadly there are correlations between the number of people from African American background that live in an area and the crime rate in that area, right? For unsurprising reasons having to do with poverty. But there is a clear sense that liberal people then tend to ignore base rate frequencies in those cases because they don't want to say that in areas where there are many people from an African American background living, then people should pay high insurance. Right? And so people tend to then abandon their actuarial judgments in those cases. I do not see that as a case of ignorance, right? Because it seems to me that certain considerations trump other considerations. So it seems to me that this is simply a case where people think, oh, I thought actuarial considerations were the only things that were relevant to decide insurance costs. But actually, it turns out that there are the moral considerations that trump it. So I do not see that as particularly a case of ignorance. But I will, if I'm right about the solution to Gendler dilemma, I think it solves the ignorance aspect as well, even if there were ignorance aspects to it. I just don't think Gendler's example is a particularly good one, because it's the experiments she looked at are not experiments where it's clear that these people are not just saying, okay, so here my ethical principles demand, because all the people who give the non-actuarial answers are people who have first in self-report described themselves as liberal. So it could be that their liberal principles there trump their economic reasons. Okay, now Gendler frames our discussion in terms of this notion of the LEF. I don't know whether you're familiar with the LEF, whether you've ever heard. Right, so she describes LEFs in many different ways in different places, but in the epistemic cost paper she describes it as innate or habitual propensity to respond to an apparent stimulus, often with an automized representational or affective behavioral triad. So LEFs are meant to be cognitive psychological states. They are meant to be not part of folk psychology. They are meant to be automatic or quasi-automatic. That means that once they are triggered, they direct behavior in a way that is not mediated by either will or consciousness. They are purely associative states, which means they do not feature in reasoning. And they are meant to have three components. A representational component, which is not meant to be a belief, but is meant to be a representation. An affective component, and a behavioral component. And these three components are never separate. And the relation between the three components is a purely associative one, as opposed to an inferential one. So they have no propositional content, although they have content, and they are just triggered by association. So the idea is that you learn this just by living in this society in an associative kind of way. And once that you have them, they just get triggered by stimuli in the environment. And they are quasi-automatic and mostly non-conscious, or not quasi-non-conscious. Right. Now, Gendler's argument hinges on three empirical claims, which I claim are all false. The first is that mere knowledge of the stereotypes is sufficient for you to form the LEF. The second is that if you have the LEF, it will be triggered in every context in which the category is salient. And so it's not subject to contextual manipulation, right? So the idea is that not only just being in this environment means you form the LEF, is that the LEF, whenever you meet a woman, the LEF will be triggered, rather than being subject to contextual manipulation, so that only in some contexts is triggered, but not in others. And the third claim she makes is that if you have these LEFs, which you have because you lived in this society, and you're also explicitly non-racist, non-sexist, then the cognitive dissonance between the two will always cause cognitive depletion, right? So error, because it always generates self-monitoring and self-regulation, that takes time, takes cognitive effort. So her argument relies on these three empirical claims, which I claim are all false. I also want to, and I'm going to show to you why I think they're all false. I think she's led to making these claims because of her commitment to this notion of the relief, which I think leads her to sort of conceive of the circumstances in a certain way that then leads her to those three claims. And I'm going to argue that instead, if we understand this phenomenon in terms of the notion of attitude as used in social psychology, we get a better handle on what is actually going on in those three phenomena. And also, we get an answer why, we are not doomed, why there is a way out. Not an easy way out, but there is a way out. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is I'll first explain to you, as quickly as I can, what attitudes are. And then I'm going to try to show how understanding the phenomena that Gendler discusses in terms of attitudes gives us a better explanation of what than Gendler gives, on what's going on there, and then why it gives us a solution. And then probably I'll run out of time. Okay, so attitudes, as social psychologists understand them, first of all, I should say, an attitude in social psychology is like the most important notion in social psychology. It's like the central concept. Okay? There is tons of work done on it. And there are, last time I looked at a review in the Handbook of Social Psychology, there are like 50, 60 different definitions, But everybody agrees that attitudes are preferences, likes or dislikes. So if you want to put it in behavioral term, aversion or attraction. Attitudes are directed at a target. So they are likes or dislikes for something or of something. That something that is liked or disliked, preferred or the opposite of preferred, is the target of the attitude. And it can be anything. It can be my umbrella, right? It can be the number 2. I always go around saying I like the number 2. I don't know why, I do like the number 2. So it can be an abstract entity, it can be justice. I mean, there's tons of work on the attitudes toward various values like justice, equality, and so on and so forth. There's also tons of work on attitudes toward various consumer goods, right? Toward, I don't know, Kellogg's as opposed to Tesco muesli. So it can be a concrete thing, it can be an abstract thing, and there's tons of work on attitudes toward social groups. So toward ethnic minorities, toward women, toward gay people, toward Catholics. So that's the target of the attitude. Attitudes have a content, and usually psychologists define the content of the attitude as the overall evaluation. So remember, attitudes are evaluations. The overall evaluation of the object toward which the attitude is directed. And they have a structure because they tend to involve, and here is where there is some similarity with Gendler, they tend to involve a cognitive state, it could even be a belief, feelings and behavioral dispositions. I don't remember the order of the slides, but I'll say something here that I think is important and is not quite in the slide. One is And the classic account of attitude is they must include all three, and I take it that that's where Gendler gets it from. So they are representational, affective, and behavioral. But more recent evidence suggests that actually not all attitudes have all three components, and that but nevertheless they are mostly affect-driven as opposed to cognitive-driven. And the reason why psychologists think that they're mostly affect-driven is because the kind of behavior that they are mostly causally responsible for, although it's more complicated than this, but where they tend to really be predictive of behavior is micro-behaviors, i.e. not maintaining eye contact, being a little bit further away, seeming a little bit offish. Those sort of things seem to be much more driven by these attitudes, these kind of micro behaviors that sometimes some people don't even notice, others are more sensitive to it, right? They seem to be, and it seems to be the affective component of these attitudes that drives these micro behaviors. Another thing that should be said, that Gendler doesn't say, which is one of the reasons why ALIAs are different from these, is that attitudes can be ambivalent. One can strongly like and strongly dislike the same thing. I'll give you an example. Say you're on a diet. You might strongly dislike chocolate and yet strongly like it. And what that means is you have an ambivalent attitude toward chocolate, right? You both like it and dislike it, right? So it's possible to have and Gendler notion of the alia tends to be very, you either like, well, it's not evaluative, but if it were, there is no sense that there can be internal dissonance in an attitude. An attitude can be ambivalent. The second thing, the next thing that is important is that attitudes can be strong or weak. And this notion of strength is really important. And it's very different from what you might think intuitively it means. Right? A strong attitude is not like a strong like. Strength is a matter of the strength of the associative relation between the components. So you can have a lukewarm like, which is a strong attitude. Okay. Strength is a feature of how psychologically connected the bits of the cluster that make the attitude are to each other. Okay. And it's not about how strongly you feel about the target at all. Now, strong attitudes tend to be, 1, predictive of behavior, 2, stable across contexts, and harder to manipulate. Ambivalent attitudes are not very predictive of behavior and are not very stable across contexts. And ambivalent, weak attitudes are not very accessible. That's one of the reasons why they are not so predictive of behavior. Not every context triggers them. It's only a strong attitude that gets triggered and is stable in every context. You have to, psychologists think of this attitude as stored in memory. And then there is an environmental stimuli that can trigger them. And if it is a strong attitude, it will not require much of a stimuli to trigger it. But if it's weak or ambivalent, it might not be triggered at all in certain contexts. So strong attitudes are more accessible, more stable across differences, more predictive of behavior, more resistant to change over time. Okay? And internally consistent, including consistent with attitude-relevant conscious beliefs. I hope you see where I'm going. Right. So it's only strong attitudes that are triggered in every context, predictive of behavior. And strong attitudes require consistency with conscious belief. Okay? The last bit I think is important is that attitudes serve different needs and so have different underlying motivations. So I say that attitude is a preference, is a like or dislike, and then there's a question, why do we have them, right? Why do we have, I mean, if social psychologists are right, our social cognition is driven by attitudes. They are the fundamental construct. Also, construct just means theoretical concept of social psychology. Right? So why do we have them? According to social psychology, it's because they serve some fundamental needs. The first is object appraisal. The view is the view that you probably are familiar with. We have to negotiate very complex environments. We need to simplify matters, and attitudes give us a way of simplifying our environment. They categorize things into danger, threat versus, food or attractive or good, and that help us direct our behavior. But they serve other function. One is social-adjustive, which is the way in which we calibrate our likes and dislikes with the like and dislikes of people we like, so that we fit in. And they also serve ego-defensive function, which is self-esteem. They are used to preserve self-esteem. And the value-expressive function, they give us a way of reasserting our own sense of personal identity by giving us a way of expressing the values that we stand for. And one attitude can serve more than one function at the same time, and they can change function over time. So, attitudes can be ambivalent, as I said, because you can be both positive and negative about the same thing. And they can be explicit or implicit, where implicit biases are implicit attitudes. I'm aware of time, so I'm trying to speed up. The only thing I want to say here is, do not necessarily think that explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes refer to different underlying representations. It's unclear. The evidence is very divided. What I would say, you should take that to mean, is representation is measured by explicit measures, i.e. by self-report. You give a questionnaire and you fill it in, or by implicit measures. Whether these two ways of measuring are measuring two different things or the same thing is an open question. What we know is that the two measures can dissociate. So people can seem very low on explicit measures of, say, sexist or racism, but quite high on implicit measures of, say, racism. And that's why social psychologists have created this expression, aversive racists. Aversive racists are people who are low on racism on explicit measures, but high on racism on implicit measures. And again, it's unclear whether what is being measured are two things or one thing, right? Okay, attitudes are not alias, and I think I've told you why. Alias do not have functions, they don't have explicit components. Alias are just all or nothing. Alias are triggered all the time, they're stable, they're predictive of behavior. Attitudes are not like that. And there is a reason why one should use attitudes rather than alias. They are empirically quite well established. Alias is something that Gendlers cooked up. And whether they exist or don't exist is unclear. But we have tons of evidence that there is, what they are we might not know, what the underlying, what in our architecture actually underlies these attitudes we might not know, but we know that there is something that plays these roles, and that has been tested for over since the 1950s. So there is a significant body of evidence. So using attitudes, something that is empirically better, is useful. But also I think it provides a richer explanation of what's going on in Gendler's own example than Gendler's own narrative. Right, first thing, how much time have I got?
So we started a bit late, so officially 5 minutes, but you can have a bit longer.
Okay. So I'll definitely only do the solution. Right. First, Gendler talks about just using a doubtful, dubious category, and that immediately biases you, just using the dubious category. But first I noticed that there are some categories that are dubious, and I would agree that using them would make you biased, but I don't see that they carry any epistemic cost. The best example I could come up, because we are British, even I'm Italian, is benefits grandeur. But in the US there would be, I forget, what is it called?
Welfare queens.
Thank you.
Welfare queens?
Yes.
I would call them.
Now, I think that if you do use this category and you do social science using the category of benefits grandeur, it is indeed a dubious category, and indeed you will suffer some epistemic cost, probably, certainly some moral cost, from using such a category. But the costs are not the costs of that Gendler talks about, right? I mean, it's not that this is a necessary category and gosh, you know, the only solution is I am deprived of this essential category, and therefore I'm ignorant or I'm biased, right? These are categories we can do without. Okay. Well, the categories that Gendler wants to talk about are not dubious because they are necessary to state some important social facts, you know, like race and gender. And this is orthogonal to the question of whether there are biological races, right? It doesn't matter whether race is a biological concept. The question is, are there significant social facts that you need the concept of race to be able to state? I think the answer is yes, right? And doesn't commit you to say races are biological, they are biological, right? Races can be invented and still you need the concept in order to explain that they are invented. Right. So the problem can't be the existence of the category per se, right? And I want to say attitudes that serve the function of object appraisal about social groups are as epistemically valuable, right? So the issue is the content of the attitude and the function the attitudes serve, right? In a nutshell, my argument, if you want, is this. It is not that having attitudes toward races and genders that in a sexist or racist society puts you in a position of being biased. It's only if the forming of your preferences are guided by the function of sharing the likes and the dislikes of your society, right? So if you form your categories on the basis to serve the function, I want to be like everybody else around me, everybody else around me is sexist and racist, so if that's the need that your attitude serves, then you will develop attitudes with those contents, right? But that is not necessary. And even if you partially do because we all want to fit in, the point is that some attitudes can be weak and ambivalent. And when the attitudes are weak and ambivalent, they only issue in behavior when that is mediated by motivation. Right. So the phenomena that Gendler, they are all effects of implicit attitude. Mere knowledge of the stereotypes is not sufficient. It's only if you want to share the likes and dislikes of your society that you will form attitudes with those contents. And even if that is inevitable because we are gregarious, right? As long as you also have this discordant aspect to your attitude will be either weak or ambivalent. And weak and ambivalent attitudes are not stable across contexts, and are incredibly malleable. They can do it. I mean, I'll give you an example of how malleable weak attitudes are, which is bizarre. If you go to the gym and cycle very hard for a little bit, you become less implicitly racist. The weak and ambivalent attitudes are incredibly malleable. The effects are very short-lived, but they are incredibly malleable and very weakly predictive of behavior. And also, they are less accessible, so more likely not to be triggered at all in certain contexts. So all of these considerations show that bias is not required, right? Bias might follow if you have a strong attitude. But you only have, you only will have a strong attitude if your consciously held beliefs are also racist and sexist, right? Right, shall I stop here and then people can ask?
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, because I've made the main point and then I was just going on to the details of how, how the attitude stuff can explain the cases more. So I'll give space to my respondent, otherwise I'll take up their space.
Okay, cheers, thanks.